Well, Joe Rogan finally got a chance to talk about the Twitter files directly with Elon Musk. Let's watch some of that.
What was that like? Because that, to me, that was the most bizarre, was the Twitter files. When you let Shellenberger and Matt Taibbi and all those guys get in the Twitter, and the response where Matt Taibbi gets audited. I mean, which is just wild. I mean, it's just so blatant and so in your face.
Yeah, it's weird. No, I mean, the degree to which, and by the way, Jack didn't really know this, but the degree to which Twitter was simply an arm of the government was not well understood by the public, and it was whatever the official government. I mean, it was like Pravda, basically. It's a state publication is the way to think of old Twitter. It's a state publication.
And was the justification from their perspective that they are progressive liberals, they have the right intentions, it's important that they stay in power, the progressive liberals stay in government and power because this is their...
There was basically oppression of any views that would even, I would say, be considered middle of the road. But certainly anything on the right. I'm not talking about like far right. I'm just talking mildly right. The people like Republicans were suppressed at 10 times the rate of Democrats. Now that's because old Twitter was fundamentally controlled by the far left.
Yeah, that's a really serious accusation and really important reporting to come out of the Twitter files. And you've heard me say it before, I just wish the project hadn't been ended, because I do think there's a continuing need for transparency at Twitter and all the major media companies. And I would hope that Elon would continue to lead by example in that way. And I just regret the project ended over what seemed like an interpersonal dispute between him and Matt Taibbi.
Yeah, it was deeply frustrating because we are so much better off now that we know about these revelations, that we know the extent to which, we might not have known. We might not have ever known how much communication there was with social media companies about the 2020 election, about so-called Russian information, about COVID, that goes, well beyond the scope. That I think people are going to have a range of opinions on what's the right level of interaction between governments and social media companies, what is genuinely misinformation and what's harmful speech and what should be allowed on the platform. But it went so far beyond, emails from the White House outreach coordinator saying, Biden is offended by this, or this is offensive to the Biden family. Take this down now. Why haven't you taken it down yet? Lists of supposedly Russian accounts being constructed by loosely government-affiliated nonprofit watchdog groups, coming up with these lists of supposedly Russian accounts that are just wrong, that were not lists of Russian accounts, and having the FBI threaten Twitter into doing something about it. This was just a pervasive threat to Americans' First Amendment rights that is now being litigated in part with the Missouri case that is actually going to be heard by the Supreme Court. So the injunction got removed. We talked about this a couple days ago. So now they are free again to network, the government to network with the social media companies. But eventually we're going to have the Supreme Court weigh in and try to sculpt some standard for what's the right level of communication. But it was a very important project. I mean, it's one that frankly shifted the target of my ire from the moderators at the social media companies to the government itself. And I'm a libertarian, so it's not that it surprised me necessarily. And it wasn't, I think the companies, obviously they do have the right to make speech-related decisions for themselves. It wasn't fun from my position all the time defending, criticizing what they're doing, but saying, but they have the right to do it. Everybody eventually rolls their eyes at that. Like, well, if you don't like what they're doing, you need some kind of solution for it, over and over and over again. But then it became, well, they don't like what they're doing either. Mm-hmm. They're sort of being browbeaten into it very explicitly. And that is a lever we can adjust. We can have, we could have a law, we could have some kind of standards for the federal government's outreach to the companies that would be better for free speech.
Yeah, one of the other things that I think is troubling is when I interviewed Matt Taibbi about this on my own podcast, most people who were interviewing him and talking to him either, had their fangs out for him, like most of the Democrats in Congress, or they were very enthusiastic about uncovering the extent to which the right in particular was suppressed. But as we saw by how the establishment weaponized themselves against Bernie Sanders in his last 2 runs, there's also a great deal of left suppression, as we're seeing right now against the speech interest of pro-Palestinian advocates, including a number of Jewish advocates who've been repeatedly compared to Nazis by Jonathan Greenblatt of the ADL and others, that there is no end to the attacks that will also come down on the left. So one of the things I asked Taibbi about was how much exploration he had done, how much access he had been given to running searches on shadow banning and the like around issues like Palestinian advocacy, looking at the 2020 Bernie primary and those kinds of things. And he hadn't had an opportunity to do so at the time that we talked, and very shortly thereafter, his access was ended. So I do regret at this time in particular that wasn't, obviously from my subjective view, prioritized, and that now all those opportunities are dried up. We saw Elon first fall out with Bari Weiss after she took what I thought was a pretty principled stand, saying that his censorship on Twitter of the Elon Jets account and the journalists that were covering the Elon Jets story was in stark contrast to all of the ideals he was stating about how he wanted the Twitter app to be free. She was then booted from the project, and then apparently because Matt Taibbi has a Substack and Elon found that to be too competitive with what he wanted Twitter to do, they ended up falling out. And I don't know, there was some implication at some point that others like Aaron Mate or Li Fang would be able to continue that work, but we haven't really heard anything about the Twitter files or any new releases from documents that hadn't already been disclosed since then. So I do think there's these ongoing questions. Elon Musk, in many ways, I think, has risen to the occasion. In other ways, has articulated a preference to go along with Modi's censorship regime, for instance, and who knows what else is happening behind the scenes. And there's a little bit of an irony that giving us the peek behind the curtain in some ways makes me more suspicious about what's going on now, not just at Twitter, but all these other sites. And I do wish there, in the course of all of this litigation that's going on around the government's right to intercede, there was also a broader conversation about what transparency consumers could or should expect from these companies to really know how these moderation decisions are being made. One way or another, however they're biased, I just wish it were transparent.
We haven't talked about this yet, but Elon Musk recently said that he was going to change the whole monetization thing to be subject to community notes. That if you're repeatedly being fact-checked by community notes, you're not going to be able to monetize those posts. I thought that was interesting. What do you make of that?
I think it's interesting. On one hand, I think it's good. It obviously disincentivizes inaccuracy or people who are intentionally lying. At the same time, right now, community notes, I think, is organically motivated by people who are really trying to correct their record. Are you going to get into a place where people intentionally try to weaponize community notes to prevent people from being able to make money on the account? Are you going to see a bunch of liberals kind of nitpicking and finding technicalities wrong with, say, a conservative's post? Because there's a way, we've seen Glenn Kessler over at Washington Post, we've seen the ways that you can find a technical mistake with almost anything. And if the community notes attaches, even if it's a very minor correction, is that going to be weaponized against people one way or the other in a way that diminishes the value of the community note?
Yeah, that's a good point. We'll have to see, because I've really liked this feature so far. It's been a huge benefit to social media. In fact, it's the only remotely fact-checking feature on a social media site that is working at all. More Rising right after this.